Hello, everybody. Welcome this fine Tuesday afternoon, early January 2021. We're excited to kick this year off with this live stream podcast here with my friend, Dr. Jeb Hurley. So forgive us for being a couple minutes late getting started here. Dr. Jeb had a meeting that unexpectedly went a few minutes over time. And we're assuming that audio and video is all working correctly right now because we didn't have a few minutes to check prior. There's just those few little intricacies of doing last minute live streams type of things. But a few housekeeping items. Just welcome with us here this afternoon. We're looking forward to an extraordinary hour here with Dr. Jeb Hurley. I know that we've got a really fun conversation planned, and there's going to be tons of value, particularly for those of you that are looking to hit the ground running in 2021 and make a huge impact in your business, in your teams, and really stretch for reaching some new heights in 2021. We will have a Q&A session here at the end of the at the end of my conversation with Dr. Jeb. So feel free at any moment to begin to add those questions into the chat of whatever platform you're joining us from. That can be LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube. We'll try to keep an eye on all of those and get to as many questions as we can after. Those questions can be anything that is leadership related, that is trust related, entrepreneurial related. Dr. Jeb and I have fairly extensive careers or entrepreneurial careers. And so while we may not be right, I don't know, maybe we're right 15% of the time, Dr. Jeb.
we're getting old, that's for sure.
We'll offer some bad advice, but it'll be fun anyway. My name is Earl Foote. I'm founder CEO of Nexus IT. We are a 22-year-old white glove outsourced IT support, cybersecurity, compliance, and cloud firm based here in northern Utah, serving northern Utah and throughout the nation, actually. And today I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Jeb Hurley. I'm going to get to a good official intro for Dr. Jeb here in just one moment. But first of all, many people ask myself and my esteemed guests on this live stream why the heck we do this. And the reality is that we've all had our own decorated careers and had our own stumbles along the way. And if we can produce some useful information that helps other leaders and entrepreneurs perhaps skip some of the pitfalls that we've fallen into, we're happy to do that and just create more community around our own local tech scene and well beyond. I know that we have people joining us actually throughout the nation, and we saw some registrants out of Canada and Australia and things like that. So we welcome everybody from around the nation, around the globe, and certainly right here at home in Utah. Quickly, I do want to just mention that I will be doing another one of these on February 1 at 12 p.m. with Brilliant Miller. We will be talking about, and Brilliant is a friend of Dr. Jeb as well, a great guy. We'll be talking a little bit about how finding the right coach can help you and your team achieve the outcomes that you're looking to achieve in life and in business. That'll be a really interesting conversation. I do have several other appearances throughout January on other webinars and live streams. Keep an eye out on my social media, for those. Those will be for Rehab Health, Swattage, the U of U, and Utah Women's in Sales. And feel free to follow Dr. Jeb and I on LinkedIn. We're both very active in creating content and being involved in podcasts and live streams and webinars and that type of stuff. So, follow us both, and we're happy to contribute as much as we can to the community. So, without further ado, I do want to introduce officially my esteemed guest, Dr. Jeb Hurley here today, who is currently the co-founder and CEO of XMetryx, a SaaS company that is dedicated to building better teams through behavioral science. Jeb's career journey began in sales and product management. Over the last 25 years, Jeb has held GM, VP, and CEO roles at companies ranging from Fortune 100 to startups and has co-founded 3 software companies. Dr. Jeb holds a doctorate in organizational leadership, which is very unique, with a research focus on human motivation and team effectiveness, along with MBA and BSBA degrees. Jeb is the author of the book Team Relationship Management, released in 2019, and The One Habit, released in 2017. Good books to add to your queues. And Dr. Jeb has over 70 published articles on team behavior and leadership. We are literally potentially talking to at least the nation's and maybe the world's foremost authority on how to apply behavioral science to leadership and creating hyper-functional, high-performing teams. And I'm happy to call this man a personal friend. I'm very honored to have you here today. So, Dr. Jeb, I know you've had an interesting journey, and it's included some bumps and bruises, and I know that this is something you're very passionate about. So, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you develop this passion? What drives you? And tell us about the journey, how that evolved from an interest into now a SaaS platform that applies your expertise.
Cool. Well, thank you, Earl. I always love when we do these kinds of things, because I start blushing because you build on this little bio, and it always takes me a minute to recover from that. But thank you. And that's really a great question, because so often, I find and I push this first and foremost on myself, that we can be driven by expectations or ideas or rewards that don't really reflect what we're passionate about. And it took me a while to figure that out. And in fact, you mentioned my second book on team relationships. I start out talking about the finding relevancy. And I think particularly as we move forward in our careers, rather than relying on sort of the laurels of the past and riding on those, thinking about how we stay relevant going forward, for me became very much a few years ago a real driver, and particularly around translating that into what has become a passion for helping young leaders really connect the dots between trust and performance. And that ultimately was also the genesis for XMetryx, the software, the B2B SaaS software that we developed. Again, with the focus being on how is it, do you as a young leader, given all of the dynamics you have to deal with and feeling as though you're changing tires on moving cars every day, really get down to the essence of what it is that will serve you well today, and as you develop your career going forward. And it turns out that at the core of that is trust.
Yeah, isn't that interesting, right? That one little piece that really makes everything fall together. And the reality is I never really put my finger on that until you and I started having conversations about it. I mean, you fumble along as a leader and look at all of these different potential principles and all of these applications, and you try so many different things, and some things work well and some things don't work that great, and ultimately when you understand that it all just boils down to trust, and if you can gain the trust of your team members, if they can trust each other, and if you can trust them, you begin to create this hyper-functional environment that produces the results that you're all trying to create, and becomes massively fulfilling. And so, I know, at a fairly youthful age, Jeb, you were thrust into a leadership role. So, were you born to be just an amazing leader out the gate, or did you fall flat on your face?
Yeah, that's, and by the way, all those on there, Earl knows the answer to this. But my first people leadership experience, it was it was thrust upon. I took it with great seriousness and with the full intention of being an exceptional leader. And if there were 10 things to do wrong, I pretty much nailed every one of them. And that was a painful experience. I think probably more so for the folks that were on my team, which was a distributed remote team. But the lessons I took away from that were really career changing. And I had the good fortune of a boss who was a tough coach and a good mentor, who really helped me understand sort of the relationship dynamics that I had set up. And he didn't use a lot of the words that like I use today around sort of the leading with trust and what that means and how to do that. But that was the essence of it. And that in so many ways, and I wasn't sort of a jerk or a toxic leader. I just did a lot of things that subtly diminished trust among the people on my team with the results you'd expect when that happens, which was pretty poor performance. More recently, I think in terms of sort of feeding that passion, I watched so many young leaders get mired in mediocrity. And when they and their teams have so much more potential. And every time, it boils down to behavior. You can have technologies that don't work quite properly. You can have processes that aren't perfect. You can have lots of dynamics going on. But at the end of the day, leadership is at its simplest about, helping people to change in a positive direction that accomplishes something more than what they would have done on their own. And it's behaviors that enable that or not.
Yeah, very, very, very good insight. So maybe if you'll entertain me for a moment, I'd like to share a little bit about my journey as what I would consider a leader, and I just feel like it's very applicable to the topic right now. So I started Nexus IT a little over 22 years ago, at the young age of about 23 years old, and as an early tech founder in the .com boom, 1998, we certainly started with a really the idea of, and I was young, obviously, right? It was definitely a bro culture, which I look back on and sometimes I'm a little ashamed of. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a bro culture in a demeaning way towards anybody, but it was definitely fun and games and let's play airsoft in the office and let's go paintballing. And I probably as a leader was just too much a buddy to everybody within the organization, right? And it was hard to produce the right results. And frankly, when a culture of trust wasn't demanded and kind of, I hate to use the word, but policed per se, unfortunately there were abuses. And so my first 5 or 6 years of my entrepreneurial, journey, I was kind of that, I was the super ideal fun boss. And then after several abuses, I went, okay, I'm done with this. And I probably went too far to the other extreme and became a jerk, on many occasions, for 5 or 6 years, I tried, pretty hardline leadership kind of style. And that didn't work out so well either. And, over the past decade or so, it's been a journey of kind of honing my leadership style and having enough camaraderie with the team that there is trust, that you create a dynamic and a vibe where, you really jive together. But at the same time, that there's enough trust and respect that the barriers and limits that should be there, are respected. Yeah. And so, while I perhaps didn't cognizantly understand the entire journey to its full, while it was happening, while it unfolded, the understanding now, particularly with, your insight and the insight of some other, great leaders that I've studied or collaborated with and mentors, understanding that how that has all boiled down really to a more productive leadership style that is based upon trust and on a positive culture. And we could dig really deep into culture, but we'll get to that maybe later today or at a later date. But let's talk a little bit more about trust. So you spent a lot of time writing on this topic, developing content around this topic, developing a SaaS platform around the topic. And so why is it that trust is so important? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, good question. Trust, trust is one of those really fascinating topics in the sense that, at once it's very common and yet can be very complex and very complex in its personal experience. I don't know, it's kind of like raising kids or something, right? Where it's, so many people do it. And yet when you're a parent, it's like, this is uniquely difficult. And so it's familiar. And yet when people try to really nail it down, it can be hard to grasp. It's a feeling, it's an expectation that we have of others. And it's a character trait that we look for or admire in others, and certainly look for people that we work with, people who are trustworthy. But, what's interesting is the real reason that trust is so vital to organization is that it's also the key to people's collective performance and well-being. And that's something that often that people who are aspiring or who are leaders and who, whether they on their own, kind of like you and I did, sort of trial and error, or have been through leadership programs, rarely is trust looked at in that context to say, wait a second, trust is all about the small micro behaviors that happen every day that we don't necessarily even pay big attention to, like the big T, trust, the big L, love, the big H, H, hate. These are the big emotions. But trust it sits at the heart of authentic transformational leadership. It's also the antidote to toxic behaviors in organizations, and ultimately offers that escape from mediocrity. And that's what makes it so incredibly powerful. It's also what makes it more subtle and more difficult to use, in the sense that just because you trust doesn't mean that you build a high trust culture in an organization. It doesn't mean that you get the benefits from it. And that's a little bit of the tricky part, is how do you translate this common experience that we all have as human beings into something that actually transforms your team and potentially your organization.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic, and something we can dig into a little bit more as we go here. But as you talk about the topic here, I mean, it comes to mind that when you, as a leader, when you begin to really understand this role of trust and how to utilize that to improve your relationships with your team members. The principle is 100% applicable to your personal life, to your personal relationships, to your intimate relationships. The reality is most every roadblock we might run into in those is a breakdown of trust or expectations. So really understanding these principles and figuring out how to apply them in your life, I think is very useful professionally and personally. Now, I know that when you've done some of your research on this topic, you've met with some of the world's foremost leading military teams, the most high-performing teams. Tell us a little bit about that and that experience and what you found in that research and what really set those teams apart.
Yeah, that's in fact, my first book, the one you mentioned, The One Habit, which was more of it's like more like a long essay. I was doing it as I was completing my doctorate, but the title itself really came from the essence of the difference, the habit, the behaviors that I saw that differentiated very high performing elite teams versus the teams that I was working with directly, as well as ones that I touched indirectly during that time. And the core of the difference, it's too easy to say that it was just trust in and of itself, because trust was both the mechanism that enabled the teams to function at a high level. It was an outcome that they all experienced in terms of There was one, actually Simon Sinek says it in one of his TED Talks, and he was working, like, as I was studying the SEALs, he had also worked with some Navy SEAL teams. And he said, the difference between, there's trust and performance, and trust is, the performance is what we deliver. Trust is, do I trust you with my wife? Do I trust you with my life? And that, that difference happens when teams of people come together and do three things. They embrace, share, and live a set of values in a very intentional way. And that's the key, is that it's intentional. It's something that those values, and they can be called norms, they can be called ground rules, but these are the way we're going to operate together as a team. Second, they are always characterized by a leader who understands and has the ability to inspire motivation on that team. They get what gets people out of bed, energized, and finding purpose every day. It's not just simply gold stars and pats on the back and things like that, like recognition, are not unimportant. And for some people, they're more important than others, but they're not the core of why we do what we do. So that's the second. And then the third is that both individually and collectively, it's about building strong, healthy, trusting relationships, and understanding that. And I was having dinner one night with a group of Israeli fighter pilots, and they made this very clear point, because we were talking about trust, and they said, look, we're not, although we may have the biggest egos, at least in Israel, they're the 1% of the 1%. We're human. We screw up as often, maybe more often than everybody, but what we're really good at putting the issue on the table. Where is that trust gap coming from, and closing it? And that expertise, that skill set, that competency is what, for a group of people like that, who literally put their lives in each other's hands every day they go to work, that was the essence of why trust, individually, organizationally, and from a relationship standpoint, was so important. And so important that they could operationalize that. It wasn't simply a concept. It wasn't something, oh yeah, I trust you, kind of casual. No, they in a very systematic way, teams that operationalize trust in that manner by far outperform their peers. And that's whether it's in the corporate sector, whether it's athletic teams, or in the case of elite military or 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 ER teams. Yeah,
it's really interesting if you start to think about all of those potential applications and think about, what really makes the elite teams rise above the rest. It's an implicit trust. It's an implicit trust of knowing, if it's on the basketball court, it's knowing that forward's going to be where he needs to be, and that point guard is going to be where he's going to be in the center, and you're going to count on him, and he's going to have your back. And anyways, and something really important that I heard you mention, here, Dr. Jeb, is this philosophy of core values or norms, and I hear a lot of new age business leaders, kind of begin to bunk, or discount the old, what they would call tired practices of having mission, vision, and values within a corporation. And so you're saying that having stated core values that your organization behaves by, that you live by, that you govern by within the organization, is actually a key component to establishing that trust.
Yeah, it's and I'll clarify, because I get the skepticism and cynicism around mission, sort of mission objectives, value, but that's because they get turned into plaques on a wall behind a piece of plastic. And that's very different than you coming together, as a team and saying, what are the behaviors, essentially? What are the values that we're going to live by? And more importantly, that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to. Because when you when you lay that as your foundation, living values, then as leaders, we just take a huge amount of potential headaches off the table. Because so often the issues that occur in any organization, on any team, you can trace back to somebody, shades of gray or small values violations. I'm going to do X rather than Y. I'm going to treat someone, this way rather than another. That if you step back and say, hey, wait a second, this is not who we are as people, as an organization. But if you allow those to just be the plaque on the wall, they deserve the skepticism and the cynicism that comes with that. If you live it, and believe me, these elite teams, they live these values. I mean, and we don't have the time, but the stories around, why it's the 1% of the 1% and who ends up becoming, a fighter pilot or a SEAL or even a CEO, in really healthy organizations, has so much more to do with their behavior and the way they live values than it does a specific set of physical skills or intellectual skills.
Yeah. And I think that's really the important thing that you've expressed here, is that the true application of those core values and living them and being accountable to them, right, is what what really makes a big difference. And let me tell you, and you mentioned it, but that isn't easy. Like, being willing to have the difficult conversations and sit down and say, something went really wrong here. What happened? Why did it happen? Let's be frank and open. Let's just, sit down as a team, figure it out. And then, truthfully and honestly being vulnerable, this is not always the easiest thing to do as a leader, especially when you have to hold somebody personally accountable for something that's happened. And, in 2020, and this is not something that I love at all in any way, because we're very proud of having a very stable workforce and team here at Nexus IT. But we had two situations where there were deviations, what we felt were significant deviations from our core values. And you have to display to the team that live, behaving within those core values is the way that we're going to establish the right relationship and that trust within the organization and within each other. And so, unfortunately, we had to dismiss, two members of our team during 2020 because there were significant deviations from those core values.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. I was just
confirming. Yeah.
Well, also, and that's why, and again, going back to the translating this common concept of trust into something that we as leaders, for all of everyone that's on the call with us today, it's operationalizing it, translating into something you can do, and you just described it perfectly. It's how you not only you live the values, it's how you weave it into each individual, what motivates each person on your team, and then integrate it into the relationships. And that's what makes it, on one hand, challenging, because it's, and it can sound like, well, this is a lot. In reality, what's really interesting, and this is something that, again, in working with elite teams, when you systematize it, when you take that approach, you actually make your life as a leader and for the people in your organization so much easier, so much better, because people know where they're at, not relative to some arbitrary, my boss is in a bad mood kind of day, but everybody's got my back here. I know where I stand. I know what's expected. And if we do this together, then I know where it's going. And that is the key to being able to deal with as we have all had to this past year. That's the key to resilience. That's the key to both psychological as well as physical resilience. That's how these elite teams, particularly whether it's athletic or military, it's how they survive the grueling mental, physical aspects of this, because they're with a group of people who together they trust, and together they live a set of values. They're motivated by the same things, and they're driven by their relationships. And when you do that as a leader on your team, it's really cool, because you don't really, it's not that you avoid difficult conversations altogether, but boy, you cut them, you have them earlier, they're easier, and you sleep better at night, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, and they're easier to deal with when you learn to deal with them early on, when you don't let them fester. And one thing that I've found is that when there is a breakdown of trust, when a gap occurs, right, If you don't address it, it generally can become very disruptive and oftentimes toxic, and begin to really eat away at the culture and dynamic of the team. And while it's difficult, when you do address it, and you do so in a gracious manner as a leader, and you work together as a team to fix it, or you hold people accountable if that's necessary, you repair that that gap that's been created, and you reinforce your team's belief in the team, in the mission, in you as a leader, right? And you kind of get everybody back on board and everybody moving forward. And we witnessed that again twice in 2020. And again, difficult things to deal with, but when you make the right decisions, you set your team up for a lot more success and a lot more fulfillment in the process. So let's talk about 2020. 2020 kind of threw us all for a bit of a loop. COVID came along. Suddenly, even massive organizations that were all working from centralized office locations became these disparate remote teams. And this introduces, I know for me, a significant new challenge as a leader. While telecommuting has actually been part of our model for 20 years, it wasn't the core of our model. And it introduced some new breakdowns of trust in our organization, some things that we had to figure out, we had to address. We're still working on some of those. So tell us a little bit about that. What's the biggest obstacle to building trust, and how has this remote workforce environment played a role in that?
Yeah, that's again, good question. And it's no question that working remotely, and even for organizations that have done it from day one, the GitHubs, the GitLabs, the companies that were built on remote first, have found it to be challenging because of a lot of the external factors people were suddenly dealing with, having to conduct school, their spouse's job and their own from, the kitchen table or 2 rooms in a house. A lot of stress for everybody. So by far, the biggest obstacle to building trust and to success on remote teams is the leader's behavior. And it has amplified in remote teams. It's amplified. And that's because in part because if you're working remotely, something that happens on a Zoom call or its equivalent, Teams, whatever, and somebody makes an offhand comment, particularly your manager, your boss, it gets amplified psychologically. If you then just switch off that call and you sit there for the next 2 hours thinking about, what did she mean? Am I going to get fired? These are all the realities of how people when you're working remote, being very conscious and intentional of those dynamics that we just identified is incredibly important. And sometimes those behaviors are overt. People, as I went through some of the same phases you did in terms of my leadership career. And if you have a somewhat toxic boss, you have to take a different approach with that than you do when it's more subtle and sometimes even unconscious in terms of approach. I was just recently writing a story that the names were changed, but a woman, Jamie, who was promoted into a very high performer, promoted into a people leadership job, and did everything right, sort of all the training and all of the best practices. And yet, by trying to be that very on top of everything, do everything, take responsibility, jump in and solve everything for her team, she actually ended up diminishing trust because people felt like they didn't trust her with results or with being able to take care of problems on their own. And she recruited some very talented people. And it was a great example of how, in a very subtle, and in her case, unconscious way, she did everything right, at least by 20th century, how do you become a good team leader standards, and yet still ended up with mediocre performance, which she was aghast at because she had been a top performer. The good news was that fairly quickly, when this was pointed out to her, she made the changes and sort of adjusted what it meant to follow best practices and recovered from that. But it is leader behavior, being very conscious of how you are living, communicating, and reinforcing those core behaviors, those core values on your team as it operates remotely. And you have to, whether it's gossip or people just, fading away, not participate, you have to jump in faster than you did in the past. And the way you dig in around what's keeping people motivated, what's getting in the way of that motivation. You have to double down on that as well. And the as you recounted, that the strength of relationships. And if there are gaps, cracks showing up, then repairing those quickly becomes your primary job. And I think that's what I've in talking with a lot of folks that are leading remotely, particularly since the pandemic, that's probably been one of the biggest and most difficult shifts. Leaders who were used to being more task-oriented, more process-focused, but because they were all co-located, that got papered over a bit, and people could interact with one another in ways that didn't cause a lot of gaps in trust. As soon as they went remote, that same style became quite detrimental to the team's performance, because now all it felt like was, I'm just being watched for my outcome, and these other, I don't know that anybody's got my back. I don't have my colleagues to go talk to this about around the proverbial water cooler over a cup of coffee. Becomes much more difficult.
Yeah. Really, really, really interesting. And I think for me, a couple things that stand out is reinforcing, those values, particularly in like employment check-in processes or employment review processes. So our team leaders meet with their team, individually, one-on-one, once every month or two. And I meet with every team member every 6 months at their 6-month anniversary and their year anniversary, and really kind of keying in on, particularly if you've seen a deviation in behavior from those core values, reminding them. And that's the thing, in a leader in this type of environment, you have to be willing to have, they don't need to be demeaning conversations in any way whatsoever, or mean, but just identifying, hey, by the way, this concern, we've seen a deviation of perhaps attitude, behavior, execution on, I want to remind you about, what our core values here are and what that all means, and why it's important, to the team. And we've found that to be a very effective, process of again, reinforcing that, hey, these are the core values that we live and govern by in this organization. And that's how we create, this environment of trust, which, allows us to be an elite, high performing team and to produce the right experiences for all the stakeholders, the clients, the team members, and the organization as a whole. And so, and really, one of the tools that has been very useful for us in that process is your SaaS platform, XMetryx, TrustMetrics. Being able to get that anonymous assessment of where we lie within the relationships and the trust within the organization, and see visually if there are gaps, right? And so prior to COVID hitting, we were consistently grouped in that upper right quadrant. Things were humming along pretty damn well. And then within the first month of converting to an all remote model, we started to see deviations of individual team members migrating to the lower portion of that upper right quadrant, or even out of that upper right quadrant. And then, of course, it's all anonymous, but we encourage them to leave constructive feedback so we understand why there's a concern and we can begin to address those. So, little by little, you start to try to make little tweaks and address those concerns. And sometimes when they've been, big enough, of course, it's anonymous, but we bring it to the entire team. We say, hey, look, we've noticed a common thread that several of you have expressed, that you're having these types of concerns. And we want to make sure that the entire team knows, so that, we address a potential blind spot, and we all are mindful and begin to, try to shift what's happening here, and create a better experience for each other in the process. So that's been really, really valuable for us, throughout the pandemic and a more remote model. So tell us a little bit about some of the benefits of leading with trust. I realize we've talked a lot about these, but let's key in on some of the things that you've found in your career and your research.
Yeah, I think that there's trust, as you would imagine, trust in and of itself, and as a sort of, when you build a high trust culture, you get all kinds of sort of residual benefits. But the three biggest that I've found are, first, that, and again, I'm going to focus on sort of the work I've done with in organizations with multiple teams, multiple various levels of experience, that as a leader, as a person, the leader learns to lead with trust, they accelerate their development as a leader. Because trust is it acts as like a catalytic agent, that when you live it, when you exhibit that, you have this pay it forward kind of effect with your entire team. And so it is an accelerant in the sense of becoming a really effective leader. Second is on performance. That, again, and I talked about it earlier, so I won't repeat myself, but that connect the dots between trust and performance is very real. And when you put trust at the center of your approach to leadership, and I'm not talking about it's not inventing a new leadership style. If, as a leader, your role is actually in many ways pretty straightforward, but it does involve some of the most challenging aspects of human dynamics, because in order to lead an organization forward, to accomplish new things, to innovate, you have to change. You have to be constantly having people embrace things that don't, they didn't wake up today saying, oh, I want a new goal. You have to be able to help people internalize that. Trust makes all of that happen. And that's the third element, which is people's well-being. And that when people are working in a high trust culture, or a high trust team environment, and I think all of it, if you've been fortunate enough to have been there, have created it, or been part of a team like that, you know what it feels like. It's what we then chase the rest of our careers, because you get up every day saying, I love working with these people. And it's not like every day's perfect, but even when there's conflict, you have a constructive way to deal with it. When there's friction, often it's there because that's what generates innovation, but it's all positive intent. And that's the third, and in many ways, I think the biggest benefit is the mental health, the reduction in stress, the lowering of friction that comes with a high trust environment. You hear it called psychological safety. I mean, there's a lot of ways to characterize it, but at the end of the day, if I'm a new leader, and I look back on, you asked early on, I reflect back on the things I did wrong, lots of them, but the things that I've gotten more and more right, that more and more right has all emanated from an understanding that if I lead with trust, if I accelerate my capabilities as a leader, and in doing so, enable others to do their best and be their best, we perform better. And then perhaps from a reward standpoint, most satisfying is to have a group of people who really feel good about what they're doing, where they're doing it, and why. And that's pretty cool. That's when people get up feeling, energized, they have a fulfilling day at work, and they click off Zoom at night feeling fulfilled, man, that's it doesn't get much better for the individual, for the team, the leader, or the organization.
Yeah. Maybe just to reiterate that, that point, and I think what you're describing here is kind of the core of what is modern productive business culture. My parents' generation, was more about like sweatshop kind of culture.
Yeah.
You get a damn paycheck, you show up, you do your damn job, and you like it, right? You go home and you like it.
Yeah.
Whatever, it doesn't matter. But the reality is, I think we've evolved as a society, and while, okay, you can't hamper every single individual within an organization, you can't cater to every whim and every desire. But when you can create an environment where your team members feel fulfilled, they feel safe, they feel that they can trust their teammates, they can trust their leaders, then you begin to produce exceptional results and experiences together. And the reality is, when the team feels great, they make sure that the clients feel great, right? That they have a fantastic experience. And when that happens, I've found that your revenue and your margins align to where they need to be. And so when you focus on making sure that the team is having the right experience, and it can't be your only focus, but when you have a very mindful focus on that, everything else begins to align and fall into place. And that's my experience anyways with it. So I have a final question for you here, and I'm going to encourage our viewers to to post some questions themselves before we ask that question, because we'll come back around to those. We have probably just a couple minutes left at the end of the hour here. But so I know you've studied and you've observed a significant amount of different types of teams, some elite, some not. What are the biggest differences you've seen between elite leaders and mediocre leaders, and how it's sometimes it's really hard to measure as a leader where you lie, right? So maybe give us some pointers on what you've observed and how you can kind of measure where you're at.
Oh yeah, that's a good. I think that the second part. I'll start with the second part, because that actually was the genesis of XMetryx, and not to, and I want to be careful not to, it's not a commercial for XMetryx, but the ability the aha breakthrough in my research was that you can measure trust, and you can do it in a way that visualizes it so that a team can get a sense of the strength of the relationships that they've got. Because to answer the first part of the question, the biggest difference was by far the strength of the relationships on a given team through over time. That was made the difference between the mediocre or worse and the exceptional teams that they had through, and I won't repeat sort of the last 45 minutes of conversation, but that ability to create and sustain those healthy, trusting relationships by far was the single biggest indicator and predictor that a team was going to perform and continue to perform better than their peers, no matter what was going on in a business cycle or a athletic cycle, or you can sort of pick the venue, but those teams consistently outperform. And it's, when you really think about it, they do that simply because you've got a group of people that are having their needs met in ways that fundamentally motivate them to look out for their teammates, to drive towards a goal, and to feel fulfilled by doing that. And so that was by far the single biggest predictor of, so when this is again where XMetryx came from, because when I began measuring this, and literally we did it on Google Forms with, there was lots of science and no sophistication to it, that we began to see, and I did this with dozens and dozens of teams of all stripes, and I could see, and it was cool in the corporate environment because I could see their performance. A lot of these were go-to-market or sales or customer-facing teams, so I had the data that showed the customer feedback or the revenue growth relative to the strength of the team. And it was incredibly causal and correlated, but more importantly, it was causal. That the ones that were tightly clustered, to your point, up in that right-hand corner, they were consistently outperforming peer teams in other countries and other places around the world as I was doing this work. So that was, for me, that was that wow, if you can just replicate this, and then those elite teams confirmed it. They're always up there in that right cluster, but they confirmed it through the way in which they go about operationalizing, as I said earlier, creating and sustaining trust, and translating that back for teams in your everyday company. Because that's where sort of my passion and mission came from.
Yeah. Isn't that very interesting? I personally have and know, friends and colleagues that are exceptional entrepreneurs, very successful, who honestly, you talk about culture and they'll say, it's a bunch of hippie bullshit frou-frou for, the new age hippies and stuff, and they don't understand necessarily this concept that if you ensure that you have created the right experience for your team, that you've created strong relationships, that you can all trust each other, that those goals and objectives that you are seeking, which generally it's business, right? We're looking for adding revenue growth. We're looking for having healthy margins so we can reinvest into the organization and our team. That all aligns when you start to make sure that the team is taken care of and has the right experience. And so, so we've got a few questions flowing in here and a few minutes to wrap up. So one of the questions is, tell us a little bit more about some of the values that you were referring to. And these values are, I know, we've gone through a really interesting exercise with yourself, and we had, our set of core values prior to that. But we sat down with you, and with our leadership team, and really helped us kind of refine those and understand what was really important and very mission critical to us. And so some of ours, if I can, offer some suggestions, you mentioned the assumption of positive intent. Yes. That was, that is one of our core values: fairness, compassion, and the assumption of positive intent. That's been kind of a game changer for us, for the entire team to understand our clients, our team members, our partners, our vendors. Nobody means you ill will. Nobody is maliciously trying to undermine you, right? Everybody's trying to create the right outcomes. Sometimes we miss the mark, right? And so we just have to figure out what the gap is and fix it. And so that's been really, great for us. The practice of growth and abundance mindsets and looking at the world from a more holistic view and all the situations and all the stakeholders from a very productive, holistic kind of view has been very, very good for us. Those are just a couple. Go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Earl, it's so I'm sitting here glowing. I can't. It's like I'm so proud. Because, again, for the listeners, we started out that, and this was part of a, today it's my Lead with Trust Masterclass. It was an earlier version that Earl actually helped me craft. But the conversation started out with things like hitting revenue goals. And it's like, no, that's not a value. That's an outcome. And what Earl just described is just spot on. That think in terms of values as the behaviors that you want to embed into your team. So whether you use kind of fancy terms like psychological safety, which means people feel that they can bring their whole selves to work, that they can feel comfortable being who they are, a zero tolerance for bias, conscious or non-conscious, the assumption of intent, good intent. Those are the types of values that you want to, as a team, and as an organization, but team by team, when you sit down and have this, and we spend an hour or two on a whiteboard where you really bring this out and get the commitment. It's powerful. It's not quite a magic wand, but it can feel like it. But it's the essence of, if there's a deep behavioral science that sits beneath what it means to someone when they have the opportunity to describe what's important to them, the kind of environment they want to work in, talk about it with their peers, and then agree to it. And that's what you're doing. And that's what makes what Earl described as so powerful.
Yeah, 100%. So another question we've got here is, can you give an example of what it is to lead with trust in an organization? I know we've had an hour-long discussion here, but maybe key in on some of the most poignant things that you've observed.
Yeah, I think it's so. And I'm again to me the notion of, it's not, I'm a lead with trust leader kind of. It's not creating a new leadership trait or style. I leave that to the academics. To lead with trust is simply that you understand that if you put that at the center of who you are as a leader, as you deal with your key stakeholders, your team, your boss, your customers, that through doing that, you will, and it goes back to those three benefits that I identified. You'll accelerate your development as a leader, you will perform better as a team, and you will create greater well-being for all of those stakeholders. And that's what it means to lead with trust.
Fantastic. Dr. Jeb, I want to, sincerely thank you. This has been a very insightful hour, a lot of fun as a conversation. I know you've dedicated a lifetime, at least an adult lifetime, to the subject matter, and it's so great to have you kind of brain dump and give us a lot of very useful thoughts and ideas and insights and tools. We have more questions, but we're running out of time, and so in the interest of respecting everybody's time, I'm going to encourage you connect with Dr. Jeb on LinkedIn, reach out, and he'll be happy to answer any questions. I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have for me. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We want to thank everybody who's attended today. This has been a lot of fun. We hope that you've extrapolated some significant value out of this, and that there have been new insights, new things that you've learned. Continue to engage. I know Dr. Jeb is doing a lot of these types of appearances, myself as well. We're happy to offer as much information as we can to the community. So continue to engage. Do you have any parting thoughts, Dr. Jeb?
No, just a big thank you to you, to everyone that joined us today. And the offer is that Earl made is genuine in terms of please reach out, connect, and if you've got questions, it's where I find my passion and purpose. So please don't hesitate, whether you have questions about your own teams, just questions in general, feel free to do that. You can also reach me at Jeb at XMetryx, XMetryx.com. LinkedIn, though, is probably indeed the easiest.
Yeah. And really quick, I know that this isn't a commercial, but Dr. Jeb's solution is SaaS platform, XMetryx. When I originally heard about it, I was like, oh, we're a small company, we'll never be able to afford that. And then I found out that it's literally pennies a month per user. It has been absolutely fantastic for us. So I would definitely reach out to Dr. Jeb or his lovely wife, Elena Newton. If you want to take a look at what they've got, it's a super easy, simple platform. You can allow your team members to give anonymous feedback at the intervals you choose, and it helps you gain a very insightful graphical representation of the strength of the relationships on the teams and where you might have trust gaps, and to assess those and coaching, of how to address those. Because I know it happens to me, like, okay, something crops up and you're like, I don't know what to do with that, but having resources, within the platform where you can get ideas of how you might be able to address when you have a breakdown in trust has been great. So reach out to Dr. Jeb, take a look at, at XMetryx. It's very valuable, very useful for any leader. And my friend, thank you so much for the time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, so much fun.
As always.
We're going to sign off. Thank you, everybody. Happy New Year. A very prosperous, successful, peaceful New Year for everybody.
Indeed.
See y'all later.
Thank you.